Hello, BookTube. It's Wednesday, and that's New Comic Book Day when new releases flood the comic book shelves, and I go and I look at them all, and I buy almost nothing. Because weekly comics for Marvel and DC, the two signature superhero comic book publishers, most of them just don't appeal to me. I'm not interested in the Bat books. I'm not, Heresy of Heresies, I'm not interested in the Superman books at the moment. I bought Justice League once in a while, but most of what Marvel and DC do, their ongoing titles are so intimately connected to massive multi-part event storylines that I have not followed, that I know nothing about, that buying the connected spin-off stuff, like for instance, there's in DC Comics, the home of Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman, there is a new World's Finest. I reflexively think of as World's Finest, a monthly comic book that teams up Superman and Batman. For decades, a half a century ago, DC Comics had a monthly comic called World's Finest, in which Superman and Batman teamed up every month. And I never missed an issue. I loved it. And they, for years, they had a Batman-Superman team-up comic that was just inventively called Batman Superman. Why it wasn't called World's Finest, I have no idea. And then that ended, and a lot of those issues were really good. But this latest World's Finest that DC Comics is publishing, their initial publishers solicits said that it was spun out of a massive event that I know nothing about. So I didn't bother to buy it, the first issue, because the publicity information for it was pretty much telling me, you're not going to understand this. You need to go back and read that event before you can. This is not just a team up with Superman and Batman. This is a spin-off from major events that you know nothing about. And too often in Marvel and DC these days, that is true. So there's precious little in the way for me to go and get. The typical place, Batman, Superman notwithstanding, would be to get a first issue and start from there. And I did that with Marvel Comics, for instance. Recently got the franchise back to Conan the Barbarian and a bunch of other Robert E. Howard personalities, and I bought first issues of Conan the Barbarian and Savage Sword of Conan. We saw them on this channel. I liked some of them. Some of those stories seemed to me to bog down right away, and that was a shame, but I predicted it. And the main thing that I was thinking when Marvel got the franchise back was, well, they might assemble a great creative team, a great writer and a great artist for the first issue of Conan the Barbarian or the Savage Sword of Conan. They might even keep that team together for the first 5 issues, but no more than that. And the people who replace that great initial team, that team of favorites or tremendously talented people, will be, no cruelty intended, far less talented. A scrub team will get the titles next. Almost as if the people, the powers that be, the executives that run Marvel and DC Comics, were only interested in the short burst at the beginning of a first issue, at the beginning of a run. Now, I have seen this happen for decades. This happens all the time. It happens more often in the 21st century than it ever did in the 20th century. People seem, the prevalence of social media, I think, makes it more and more easy for people in all walks of life to simply lie, to just plain out tell a lie. And to think that it's part of their job to do. It filters all throughout everything that is in the world. Look at YouTube, for instance. Not our little corner of BookTube. Not our little corner of BookTube where we tell the truth and just talk to each other. But look at the rest of YouTube. Even the larger, more glitzy, fairy-like precincts of BookTube. You click on a video, whether it's a van life couple or a cooking show or a 100,000 subscriber booktuber or a self-help guru, and you can tell immediately that they are lying. You don't even know, your instincts might not even tell you right away exactly what they're lying about, but you can tell you're being lied to. That you can tell that the person on the other end of the camera never talks that way except when they're on camera. Maddening. Absolutely maddening. And that is reflected in the comic book world, because comic books, tiny little celebrities, the writers or artists who become popular in one way or another in the comic book world, become fan favorites. In the 20th century, you had fan favorite writers and artists. You had people who always had work. But then they never seemed to let it go to their head. And they would stick to a title for a long time. Long enough to build a run. Long enough to make an impression on the title. And that doesn't happen anymore, usually, in the 21st century. One of you pointed out Mark Bagley on Ultimate Spider-Man and Brian Michael Bendis on Ultimate Spider-Man. But nowadays, the lying comes in because the stars, the writers especially, but also the artists sometimes, will do pro forma interviews in which they say some variation of, all my life I have wanted to write/draw this character, this particular title. It's like a dream come true. It's so fake. It's so obviously a lie that the only reason these people do it over and over again, you've never had an interview with a DC or a Marvel writer about their new job writing such and such, starting with a new first issue, without them saying that they've dreamed their whole life of writing that thing. It's never happened in the 21st century. So how many dreams do these people have? but I realize that the only reason that these writers and artists say such nonsense so quickly and so easily, I think, is because the prevalence of social media in the 21st century has made it easier for everybody to just lie, and to consider lying to be a normal part of conversation, a normal part of the discourse, when it isn't. It's as wrong as it was. It's as wrong in 2020 as it was in 1820. And that is the long way around for me getting to the fan favorite and Messiah complex DC writer Brian Michael Bendis, who became a hit with several long runs on comic books, and boy, oh boy, let it go to his head. He let it go to his head so violently that it blew the hair off his head, so he is now Lex Luthor bald. And he has got his hands on Superman, and he is in large part the reason why I don't read the current run of Superman, which is unthinkable. I have read Superman from the beginning almost, and yet I wouldn't dream of it now. A Superman who is a thoroughgoing cynic, a Superman whose father, Jor-El, survived the destruction of the planet Krypton, and is kind of sort of a villain, a scarred villain, and right on the horizon, a Superman who decides to reveal his secret identity to the world. This is this is the executive powers at DC Comics just saying, well, we don't care about comics at all. They don't make us any money. They've been losing money for years. And you're, I guess, a kind of a big deal here. We don't really care what you do. Go ahead and do it. It's the intellectual property. You don't kill Superman without telling us. But anything else you want to do, it's funny books. Who cares? Brian Michael Bendis certainly doesn't care. One of the ways that you get our writers and artists to come on a title for 2 minutes and then go is because they not only don't care about that title, they don't care about comics. They don't read comics on their own. They are not comic book fans. If they ever were, they aren't anymore. Otherwise, they would stick around. Otherwise, those protestations that they've always dreamed of writing such a thing and have great ideas and long-term plans would be true instead of self-evident lies. And the reason why I'm talking about Brian Michael Bendis is because after a long time of DC Comics not having a Legion of Superheroes comic book, Legion of Superheroes premiered 50 years ago as a backup feature for one issue of Superboy, The Adventures of Superman when he was a boy in Smallville in the 1950s. And they were a hit. It was a story about a gigantic super team of superpowered teenagers 1,000 years in the future. They use a time machine to come back and induct Superboy into their club because he's a legend. In their time, he's a legend. And Legion fans were born in that first appearance and were vocal about it and wrote in and said, we want more. We want more appearances of the Legion, and we want more members. If you're calling this the Legion of Superheroes, there must be more than the original 3 members that we saw. There must be a large team, perhaps the largest superhero team. And sure enough, sooner rather than later, the Legion became more popular in Superboy's comic than he was himself. Just by letters, by old-style, typed and handwritten, stamped letters. So the Legion they came back for more and more guest stars, and finally they had a regular backup feature of their own, and then they took over the book, and Superboy moved off to greener pastures, and then in those greener pastures, the Legion was made a guest appearance and was enormously popular again, got a backup feature again, eventually took over that. And that has been going on over and over again. The Legion has had a spotty publication history, sometimes limping along in 7-page backup features forever and ever, then getting a comic book of its own, full-length issues. Creative types, writers and artists, have always been drawn to it. More so writers than artists, because eventually the team's numbers did grow to something like 30 active members, and that's a pain in the neck for an artist to do, unless you're George Perez. But people kept coming back to the Legion. They kept loving it. And DC kept doing mega events, several of which retconned its entire history. And if you're dealing with a title that is set 1,000 years in the future, if you retcon the present, naturally it gets wiped out and you have to rebuild it. So the Legion has been rebuilt a number of times. And for the last 4 or 5 years, there was no Legion comic at all in DC Comics. And those of us who pined for it hoped that someday DC Comics would revive this thing. this thing that has a more rabid fan base than any other comic in the world. And they did. They finally revived it, and they gave it lock, stock, and barrel to Brian Michael Bendis. So it was a classic case of being careful what you wish for. I watched some of the preliminary excitement about that. I watched Brian Michael Bendis do his pro forma interviews in which he is simply lying about how excited he is to do the Legion. There was only one thing that he wanted to do with the Legion of Superheroes. Only one. I think that if you were to look at the preliminary to his run on Superman, there would be only one thing that he wanted to do. He wanted to reveal Superman's secret identity to the world. And all the rest has been fan dancing. I believe, he'll never admit it, it'll never come to light, but it's my theory. I've been reading comics for a very long time. I've been reading these interviews for a very long time. I think the only thing that Brian Michael Bendis wanted the Legion of Superheroes for was to gender and race swap a lot of the characters. To have it be, as he puts it in one of his early interviews, not just a group of white people running around the galaxy. And in response to that, I have to say, the people who care about such things don't read the Legion. And the people who read the Legion don't care about such things. So it is a perfect way to identify a carpetbagging parvenu, which is exactly what I think Brian Michael Bendis is. But nevertheless, when Marvel got the license to Conan, and I saw, okay, this is a pretty good lineup that you've got for the initial runs on Conan and Savage Sword of Conan, I thought, okay, they're pretty good lineups for the initial run, but they'll never last. And the only good that will come of this is that the popularity of that initial run will allow Marvel to open the floodgates on reprinting older Conan stuff, on delving into the archives. That's exactly what happened. Marvel's been coming out with these beautiful, hardcover, full-color, omnibus edition reprints of all of Conan the Barbarian and all of Savage Sword of Conan. Marvelous. Just incredible. A gift to Conan fans. And there's a lot of activity behind that. Those volumes are clearly doing well because they're up to many volumes in the planning and many volumes are coming out. They have not stalled, in other words. Marvel Comics has realized that no matter what happens with the monthly comics, those reprints will sell. And so when I learned that Brian Michael Bendis was going to be taking over the Legion of Superheroes and that there'd be a new full-color monthly Legion of Superheroes comic, I thought two things. One, he won't stay for long, and neither will Ryan Sook, the great artist that they got to do the first issue. They won't stay for long. My idea was that they would stay for the first 6 issues, which is usually the preset story arc that the powers that be figure is just long enough to make a paperback trade edition down the line, and then they would go. Despite all their protestations about it being a dream come true and the book they've always meant to do, they would go. Right after that was over, and they would never come back. And that my prediction was that DC Comics would do what it always does in circumstances like this, which is to reap the benefits of the bump of having really good top-draw talent for that first arc, and then bring in scrubs, bring in people who are learning the craft who aren't very good, watch the sales plummet, and say, well, I guess the Legion doesn't have fans anymore. That is not the correct answer. That is not the correct lesson. If you torpedo the title, then saying the Legion doesn't have fans anymore is not the correct lesson. But I figured that's what will happen. But the initial burst of popularity might prompt DC Comics to release lots of older Legion stuff in all sorts of formats. There have been 2 big classic Silver Age Legion of comic book omnibuses. There's another one coming out this summer. Maybe there'll be other trade paperbacks. That would be wonderful. I'm waiting for that. But in the meantime, I told myself, this isn't going to be the very first incarnation of the Legion of Superheroes that you don't buy on the comic stand on New Comic Wednesday. So I have made a decision to buy this thing as long as it lasts. Now, I predict how long it's going to last. I predict that Brian Michael Bendis And I predicted originally that Brian Michael Bendis and Ryan Sook would be on this for 6 issues, and that their fan base would make sure that those 6 issues did well, and that after 6 issues, when the first story arc is concluded, they would both vanish, and scrubs would be brought on, writers who don't know anything, artists who can't draw team books. The sales would plummet, and that the series would be canceled after around issue 12, 15, something like that. I still do predict that in 2022, the Legion of Superheroes will not still have an ongoing comic book, and it will be eons before we see another one. And it will be DC blaming the Legion instead of blaming their own hand-handed operation of the Legion. But in the meantime, I bought Legion of Superheroes number 3. This is the alternate cover by Oliver Coipel, who's a great, great comic book artist, just a fantastic comic book artist, who nevertheless is off the reservation. This is just a standard portfolio piece of the team soaring into action. That is John Kent. That is not Superman when he was a boy. That is Superman's teenage son, John Kent, who is the version of Superboy in the Legion of Superheroes this time around. And if you don't know the Legion, you're not going to be able to tell that a lot of these characters have indeed been race swapped. You have a black Lightning Lad. You have a sort of a mocha-skinned Ultra Boy. You have an Oriental Cosmic Boy. But that's not the problem. The problem here is that is very wonky, but nevertheless, comics used to have style guides. They used to have series books. And if you were going to draw something, it had to look the same. It had to look right. Superboy has ribbing all over his costume, ribbing on the sleeves, ribbing on the pant legs. If you can see there, Ultra Boy also has ribbing all over his costumes. And so does Lightning Lad. You look inside the issue, there is no ribbing like that. So the artist and the cover artist are not drawing the same characters. It's a little bit annoying. It's a tiny little detail. Far more annoying is the fact that in this issue, Ryan Sook draws, I think, probably 5 pages, with maybe breakdowns for a 6th page, and that's out of 21 pages. So this issue is written by Brian Michael Bendis, but it is drawn by Ryan Sook and someone named Travis Moore. This is what Ryan Sook can do. A gigantic, gorgeous 2-page spread. There are what our characters look like. Superboy has gone back in time to the 21st century and retrieved his teammate Robin, Damian Wayne, and brought him to the 23rd century, to the Legion. Figures, if I love it, you'll love it too. You're my buddy. And then we get this. Now, that is very dramatic, but that is not Ryan Sook. That is worse. It's more wooden. It's more fine grained. There's less of the there's less of the free confidence that comes with a slightly better artist. Which means that my worst prediction about this thing was off by a wild margin. Ryan Sook has already left after 3 issues. 2 issues and 5 pages was all that they could get this guy to stick around for. So who knows if Brian Michael Bendis will make it to 6 issues. I think it's unlikely. And that's a little annoying. And the lack of the commitment is part of the annoyance. Another annoyance is the way Brian Michael Bendis writes. Every character in this issue interrupts every other character. No character ever gets a complete sentence off. And I think that's probably his way of thinking, well, it's a crowd of teenagers, so it's going to be unruly, and maybe that's how kids interrupt each other. I don't know. I have no idea what his rationale is, but it makes for an incredibly disjointed reading experience that isn't meant to be. It isn't meant to be disjointed in the way that it is. And Robin goes right home. It's obviously a contravention of time travel rules for a Superboy to just go back to the 21st century and pluck his best friend and bring him forward to the Legion era, and it's fixed in the course of the issue. So what's the big deal? Why did it happen at all? I have no idea. None whatsoever. The main plot line from the first 2 issues, the Trident of Aquaman, is barely mentioned in here. Instead, the original the original thief of the Trident of Aquaman, the father of Ultra Boy, who turns out to be a general on the planet Rimbor, ends up being the main character here, who he yells, he blusters, about unifying his planet, about it being a civil war and all that sort of stuff, and for some reason seems superpowered. No explanation is given, but he shouldn't be. But precious little in the way of exposition has been given in this run at all. And I hesitate to call it a run because it's obviously falling apart even now in the third issue. Unbelievable. Just unbelievable. You would think that the powers that be at DC Comics, the editors of DC Comics, would say to Brian Michael Bendis, if they can control him in any way, but certainly to Ryan Sook, okay, well, you have to sign a contract here. Fine, we're going to launch the Legion of Superheroes, and you're a popular artist, and you're doing great work. I mean, that double-page spread I showed you is great work. But nevertheless, we know that it's the 21st century, and there's piles of coke out there everywhere, so we're going to make you sign a contract for 6 issues. You'd think they'd have done that, so that we aren't getting, what's his name again? Travis Moore on issue number 3. But we are. So there were positives in here. There were bits and pieces that I liked. I like the big operatic feel of it. I like the fact that the Legion members are kids. They are most of them quite recognizably kids. That is a weak spot. When Mark Waid wrote the Legion, that was an enormous weak spot. They all talked and acted like 50-year-olds. It takes a bit of a knack to do that, so hats off to Brian Michael Bendis for at least getting that right. But God knows what's going to happen to this thing. If you've already lost the artist that sold it to fans, how long will it be before the artist-writer team is gone, and who will take their place? I have no idea. At least there hasn't been any fundamental damage done that a new writer or a new artist would have to correct. The most fundamental thing is this idiotic race swapping. But it's mostly idiotic for the things that it backhandedly says about everybody who ever wrote the Legion or loved it. But that's a touchy subject for another time. So that was the only comic that I bought today. There were a couple of graphic novels that I might have been interested in, but they didn't seem to be at the comic shop that I went to. The comic shop that I went to has comics stuck in a remote, dark, spiderweb-infested corner of the second floor. Nowhere near a prominent item, nowhere near anything that they pay serious attention to. And so they probably don't order everything. I am within relatively doable walking distance of an actual comic shop. Not the place that I go, despite the fact that it's called Newbury Comics, their emphasis is on tchotchkes and t-shirts and vinyl and whatnot, not on comics at all. Whereas an actual comic shop would get probably everything that's out in any given week. And I am relatively within walking distance there, but then again, you see the problem, right? Which is, this is the only thing I bought today. There were 20 new issues today. I only got this, and I wasn't all that impressed with it. So, even though it's a small walking distance, it's not enough. It's not close enough to warrant the effort. So that was Comic Book Wednesday for today. Legion of Superheroes number 3. And we'll just hope for more next week. We'll hope that maybe there's a graphic novel or something in the mix for next week that I can tell you about. But I wanted to revive Comic Book Wednesday, even though I have a feeling that we're going to have to start delving into back issues and collected issues, older stuff. And that's fine by me. Anyway, I'm going to wrap this up, but I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.